What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network for episode number 1 of my new series, Questions, Comments, and Concerns, in which I will answer questions, review comments, and consider concerns from viewers just like yourself on a specific topic regarding the Pokemon trading card game. Today's topic is Evolving Skies, the next Pokemon TCG set coming out in August 2021, and we're hearing from my patrons over at patreon.com/Celios Network today. In QCC number 2, we'll hear from YouTube comments, so be sure to leave your questions, comments, and concerns in this video about Evolving Skies, and you might be featured in the next episode. A quick shout out to my sponsors, PotownStore.com, the best place to get ptcgo codes. Be sure to use code CELIO for 5% off. And PokemonCard.io, the place where you can find all of my standard format deck lists and create your own and share them with the community. Also, as I mentioned, the questions, comments, and concerns in this video are from my patrons over at patreon.com/Celios Network, where you can support me monthly for article posts, messaging about the Pokemon TCG, and extra perks like this where you get to involve yourself in exclusive content. Our very first QCC comes from Andy McCrimmon, and Andy says, I see Training Court is finally getting more love. Any other underplayed cards from early Sword and Shield sets finding homes? I definitely agree here, Andy. Training Court is getting more play now. I think that's a product of Path to the Peak coming out and players wanting to play some sort of stadium to bump it. And if they don't want to play Chaotic Swell because it doesn't give them any value in other matchups that don't play Path to the Peak, then something like Training Court might help their deck. For example, Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX pairs very well with Training Court because it needs energy in the hand to accelerate and draw cards. So Training Court is a perfect match there if you don't want to play Chaotic Swell or Path to the Peak yourself. Training Court works out well there. I think there are a lot of other underplayed cards that are either starting to see play now, or will see play with Evolving Skies, or will see play in rotation. So I did pick out a few of those to talk about here. In regards to cards from earlier Sword and Shield sets that are now seeing play in Standard, I think Drizzile and Inteleon are two obvious choices for this, because they both have the ability Shady Dealings, which allows you to search for a trainer, or on Inteleon 2 trainers upon evolving, and it makes the entire evolution line worth playing now that the new Sobble and Chilling Reign can search out more Sobbles or even other Rapid Strike Pokemon if you're playing a Rapid Strike deck. And you also have the choice of playing the Chilling Reign Inteleon that can ping damage onto your opponent's board. So you have an entire evolution line, basic stage 1 and 2 different stage 2s that are all valuable to play for different reasons, making this evolution line really good. And now Drizzile and Inteleon are finally seeing play, which I do think was just a matter of time. And the new Sobble and the new Inteleon and the speed of the format slowing down just a tiny bit all came together to make these cards finally see a lot of play as support Pokemon in many different archetypes. A card I recently saw played to success is this Darkrai from Darkness Ablaze, which Gabriel Smart played in an Eternatus Weavile GX deck to top 8 of an online tournament. It's used for the Vortex of Darkness attack, which does 60 damage for 3 colorless energy, and does 20 more for each dark energy attached. So if you're only playing dark energy at a minimum, it does 120 damage. This can be used to give yourself advantage in the prize trade, or attack into Pokemon that cannot be hit by V and GX Pokemon like the Decidueye from Darkness Ablaze and Altaria from Champion's Path. One last card I thought of for Andy's question is Rose, the supporter that allows you to attach up to 2 basic energy cards from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon VMAX, and then you have to discard your hand. This card came out in Darkness Ablaze and has seen little to no competitive play and success. But with the release of Evolving Skies and, more importantly, Rayquaza VMAX, I do think Rose will finally see play in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 meta archetype in Rayquaza VMAX decks. We've seen it being played a bit in Japan already, and I think Rayquaza VMAX will really wait until post-rotation to take off, but I do expect to see Rose being played in competitive decks finally, which did take quite a while, and I think many people thought Rose would have been played already in competitive decks, but I do really think that it will finally see its day in the spotlight. Maybe the spotlight will be a little dim, but it's going to be there. The next question comes from Nikki Violet, and Nikki asks, if any, what card is the Ice Rider VMAX of Evolving Skies? The card that's not as expensive, highly played, but is still extremely competitive. Something like the Ice Rider to Shadow Rider or the Single Strike to Rapid Strike. Well, you've got quite the question here, Nikki, because there are a lot of VMAX coming out in Evolving Skies, and with many of them being Eevee evolutions and another being just a fan favorite Pokemon in Rayquaza, a lot of these cards might be expensive either in real life or on ptcgo just because of the fan favoritism of the cards and people wanting to build decks with them. I'd have to say that Rayquaza VMAX is likely going to be the top dog in terms of the card everybody wants to build a deck around and will be the most expensive to get, whether it's in real life or on ptcgo. I think Duraludon VMAX will also be a card people want to play with, but I don't know if I would necessarily call it the Ice Rider VMAX of the set. So I'm going to go with Umbreon VMAX, which Umbreon VMAX might still be pretty expensive because, like I said, it's an evolution, and also it can go in many decks, both now and in the future, of course, when Gengar VMAX finally comes out. So I think I'm going to go with Umbreon VMAX for being kind of not the most expensive, but still a very good card, and it can also go in several decks or just be played on its own. So there might even be a world where Umbreon ends up being more expensive than Rayquaza at some point. But for starters, when the set comes out, I definitely expect Rayquaza to be the most expensive because it's the big shiny card of the set. It's a fan favorite Pokemon, and it looks like it should be a pretty good focused card of a deck built around it. A fairy says, Dragon is back, but they kill fairy. The world is wrong and I wish to change it. Obviously a concern there. And then as for questions, Metacham looks like it's very difficult to get to work, but the additional turn potential is super strong. If you were to attempt to try and make it work in an ideal situation, how would it look like for deck building and against what decks? So let's start off with the concern at the top. Dragon is back, but fairy is still gone. I'm actually extremely excited for how they're bringing Dragon back, not only because of the cool little claw slash on the top right corner of the card, but because they don't have weakness, and weakness plagues the game right now with 3 prize monstrosities of Pokemon cards that can just knock each other out with a breath because they're weak to each other, and it makes the game very, very volatile and matchups very volatile. And I'm so happy to see Dragon not having weakness printed on the cards, because that means that the decks can be weak to strategies other than just being weak to the printed color on the opposing card that the opponent really has no say in. I'd much rather be outplayed by the opponent using their strategy correctly against my deck, which has a disadvantage to their strategy, as opposed to just losing because their card is red and my card is green. So I do like Dragon, but of course I would love to see Fairy stick around because Purple Sylveon just does not do it for me. As for Metacham V, I agree that it looks really strong, and actually this past weekend we saw it being played in the Japan Championships 2021 in Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX and Teleon decks, and I believe that's where it will find its main home, is with RS Urshifu and Teleon decks, because that deck is already spreading around damage, and Metacham's 2 damage counters to take an extra turn seems like it's just going to be a perfect fit there, and we've already seen some evidence that it is. So I expect it to be played in exactly RS Urshi with Inteleon. It might not see play in other Rapid Strike decks or even other decks teching in Urshifu for the fighting weakness. Something interesting I'd like to see Metacham V experimented with is Rayquaza VMAX. Now, although Rayquaza VMAX and Metacham V are Rapid Strike, they don't really have natural synergy just due to that, since Rayquaza VMAX decks shouldn't be playing Rapid Strike energy anyway, but Rayquaza VMAX decks are playing Flaffy, which can accelerate energy to anything, so you can accelerate a lightning or 2 to Metacham V for its Yoga Loop energy cost, and then clean up a Pokemon that was not fully knocked out by Rayquaza VMAX. Maybe Rayquaza leaves a Pokemon with 10 or 20 HP on one of the previous turns, and then you can clean that up with Metacham V, take your knockout, and then get an extra free turn to be attacking with Rayquaza VMAX, which could potentially just win you the game that next turn, since Metacham V takes, let's say, 3 prizes, and then you have an extra turn to power up more energy to Rayquaza VMAX and take another potential 3 prize knockout. So this is just a fringe use that I think is a possibility for Metacham V, but I think its main home will be in the RS Urshi and Teleon decks. Patrick Wall says, it seems like we're about to enter a double triangle meta with Urshi Shadow Rider Eternatus / Gengar and Zacian Victini Ice Rider. So weakness may very well be more of a consideration than it's been in a while. How does that impact the way you build decks and decide what to play in a large tournament? So you already decide what you want to play partially based on the matchup spread, what decks you're fine with losing to or having a hard time against, and what decks you'd prefer to have a better matchup against based on how popular you think they're going to be. When we get into triangle metas that are based on weakness, it can turn into a bit of a mind game and also a little bit of luck, because as long as there is some portion of the deck you don't want to run into being played, there's always going to be a shot that you'll hit it in, you know, whatever rounds of the tournament, or at least in Swiss rounds. And then in day 2, you see which decks did not have a good conversion rate, and you might be really well off or really poorly off, depending on if your good or bad matchup in that triangle made it into day 2 alongside of you. But this really makes me think of the NAIC 2018 format, where the metagame had a very large triangle formed, which was most of the meta. Psychic Malamar versus Zoroark versus Buzzwole Lycanroc. Buzzwole Lycanroc on paper was good against Zoroark, then Zoroark was good against Malamar, then Malamar was good against Buzzwole. In this triangle, I chose to play Zoroark, taking a good Malamar matchup, and then having a couple cards teched for the Buzzwole matchup, but making sure I didn't hurt my good matchup. So typically what I like to do is find the deck that can most easily tech for its bad matchup while not losing enough consistency to turn its positive matchup into an even one, if that makes sense. So let's say you have a 60-40 matchup and a 40-60. If you could make that 40-60 into a 50-50 matchup while keeping your favorable at around the 60-40, then that's typically what I see as an ideal situation. But if it's solely based on weakness, like you're saying here, so Victini hitting Zacian for weakness and Zacian hitting Ice Rider for weakness, it might be a little different. Although these decks can all beat each other just off of really aggressive starts or one player whiffing an energy or something like that. So I don't think it's going to be as cut and dry as Ice Rider versus Victini, so I'm always going to win, because in this post-rotation standard format we'll be going into, Victini or Ice Rider or Zacian just getting a turn 2 boss on the opponent's Pokemon V that they attach to is going to be really, really brutal, and can just kind of negate the fact that you're playing against a deck that your main Pokemon is weak to, because you just got a more aggressive start. So kind of a side note, I think going first is going to matter a lot in post-rotation standards, so we're going to have to see how volatile that really is. But yeah, just a little bit of a dialogue on how I pick decks going into a quote-unquote triangle meta, at least a triangle that forms at the top of the metagame. And we'll have to see exactly how strong this triangle is. That is, how much of the metagame it takes up, because if there's 2 triangles forming, that's 6 decks, and then you don't really have to worry about your bad matchup that much if 6 decks are taking up like 60% of the metagame. So you also have to see how much of a percentage of the metagame you think that certain decks are taking up, and then try to take the best matchups to the most popular decks and continue metagaming along the way to make sure that other players aren't also making that adjustment, and then the metagame changes because of that. Next, from Thielman12, we have the question, will Duraludon VMAX be viable at all? Also in that deck, which V is better to use? To answer the first half of that, I definitely do think Duraludon VMAX will be viable. It's not complete bulk. It's not a bad card at all. It's just a question of, are there better choices to play instead of it? which would keep it as a tier 2 to tier 3 or rogue card. But it does offer a mechanic that is different than any other wall type Pokemon that we have right now, which is preventing all damage done to it by Pokemon that have special energy on them. Of course, this can be played around by just not attaching special energy or playing Path to the Peak to shut off Duraludon VMAX's ability. With all that being said, my answer to the first half of this is yes, Duraludon VMAX will be viable. In terms of which Duraludon V to use, that's pretty simple. You want to use the Metal Duraludon V if you're playing a deck with Metal Saucers and basic Metal Energy, and you want to play the Dragon type Duraludon V if you're playing Single Strike Energy, because Single Strike Energy cannot be attached to the Metal Duraludon V since it is not a Single Strike Pokemon. Metagame ptcgo says, I think we all agree that having no stamp or N will be hard to have a good comeback. I'm scared that slow decks like Dragapult will see no play because they will be run down by Victini and Ice Rider. I think Lapras VMAX will finally be good, but still needs a good deck list. So on the stamp and N thing, yeah, I agree, Metagame ptcg. I do think that's a valid concern to have. Without reset stamp, without N, without that kind of comeback mechanic in the game right now, or at least being printed in the card pool that we have for Sword and Shield through Evolving Skies, I do think that aggressive decks have an inherent advantage, because in a game where you only need to knock out 2 or 3 Pokemon a lot of times to end the game, aggressive decks don't really have much time to burn out. They are going to take a few important knockouts and then the game is over. And reset stamp or N or very, very strong single prize Pokemon are going to be the things that stop that. Another thing that can stop it is wall decks being popular and not being teched against, or not having techs that are easily thrown into the V and VMAX decks. So things like Decidueye, Altaria, Zamazenta V, maybe even Duraludon VMAX can be the things that kind of keep the aggression in check. Since we don't have a reset stamp or N to keep the aggression in check, we are going to have to find something, or the immediate post-rotation standard format does have a chance to be pretty linear and a little bland if it's just aggressive decks versus aggressive decks. So we'll have to see if we get a printing of a card that allows us to have a comeback mechanic that could be put in most decks, like a reset stamp or like N, or if strategies like the walling Pokemon, Decidueye, Altaria, Zamazenta V, if they're going to be powerful enough to give people a reason to not just play the most aggressive deck that they can find. As for Lapras VMAX, Lapras VMAX seems like it could be okay. It does need a lot of energy on it to one-shot VMAX Pokemon, so I do think the appeal to Lapras VMAX is that it has the potential to one-shot other VMAXs, whereas some VMAXs just can never one-shot something that's not weak to them, like Ice Rider, Cali, and Eternatus VMAX, etc. So Lapras VMAX does have that pretty much infinite damage output potential, but it does need, you know, a ton of water energy. It has to set up Frostmoth. You have to set up the Lapras VMAX itself. So it does have a chance to be better than it was because Pikaram's leaving. And as long as there's not an immediate lightning type replacement for Pikaram that takes up a large percentage of the meta and is a very strong deck, then Lapras VMAX could see some play, but I don't think it's going to make up for the lost time. I don't think Lapras is going to become tier 1 or anything like that. Ending today's episode with a rapid fire round. Andy McCrimmon threw a bunch of them at us, so here we go. Rapid Strike, Urshifu seems scary without bench barrier. I agree. Watching your tabletop, Rayquaza VMAX doesn't seem too broken, which is a relief. Would you agree? Yeah, Rayquaza VMAX is not broken, but it is strong. We'll have to see if it can deal with not having a bench barrier to protect its flaffies. I'm really enjoying Inteleon VMAX at the moment. Viable in Evolving Skies meta. I'm not sure if Inteleon VMAX has enough to go in post-rotation without the Rapid Strike Inteleon VMAX to add some supplemental damage and a backup attacker, but I do think it's a real viable deck once RS Inteleon VMAX comes out as well. And lastly, Andy says, I had an idea for a bench barrier. Single prize basic with 90 HP, which protects your bench, excluding itself. Yeah, I think that would be fine. I also think a reprint of Machoke from Guardians Rising, or something that is essentially a reprint of that kind of ability, would be good as well. We don't exactly need a reprint of Mew to protect the bench, but I think some sort of tech that allows players to deck build to make a difference in their games could be good, because if Rapid Strike Urshifu is just oppressive to single prize Pokemon, then that's going to be something similar to ADP being oppressive to single prize Pokemon, and we definitely don't want to see that again. So yeah, good idea for a bench barrier that does not protect itself on the bench. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you to all the patrons who participated in this inaugural episode of Questions, Comments, and Concerns. And please leave it in the comments below so you can participate in the next episode. What do you have to say about cards from Evolving Skies or the post-rotation format? It can be about how viable the card will be, telling me why you think a card will ruin Standard, or what deck you're excited to build and why. I'll open up that same prompt to you that I opened to my patrons, and you can be in episode number 2 of QCC just by leaving a comment down below on this video. I hope to hear a bunch of neat ideas, comments, concerns, questions from you all in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. As always, the channel is sponsored by PotownStore.com and PokemonCard.io, so please check out those links below. And if you'd like to consider becoming a patron of mine at patreon.com/CeliosNetwork, that link is also available in the description down below. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for daily Pokemon TCG content if you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on Celios Network.